Welcome, focused learners. Today, we're turning our analytical lens onto one of the most infamous figures in all of ancient history. You know the name, Emperor Caligula. We've all heard the stories, right? The ultimate tyrant, a guy just completely detached from reality. But today, we're going to systematically deconstruct his absolute most famous legend, his supposed literal war against the ocean. We're going to look at the hard evidence, the brutal military context, and the ancient political spin to see if we can finally separate the madness from the myth.
All right, Section 1, the War on the Sea, Battling the Waves. So let's set the scene. The year is roughly 40 AD. We are standing on the freezing, wind-swept beaches of the English Channel. The mighty Roman army, commanded by Emperor Caligula himself, is gathered on the coast. They are supposedly preparing for a massive, historic invasion of Britain. The tension is palpable.
But instead of boarding the ships, the story goes that things took a truly bizarre turn. Now, you have to ask yourself the core question here. Why on earth would a highly disciplined, battle-hardened Roman legion suddenly just attack the ocean? Well, the traditional narrative claims that Caligula, in a fit of absolute sheer insanity, literally declared war on Neptune, the god of the sea, and ordered his elite men to throw their javelins and stab their swords into the crashing surf. I mean, it's a wild image, right? And it comes directly from the ancient Roman historian Suetonius. He writes that Caligula suddenly commanded his soldiers to gather seashells and fill their helmets, calling them spoils from the ocean. It's an incredibly sensationalist account, and it's literally the foundational text that built Caligula's reputation as an irredeemable lunatic. But as critical historical investigators, we really have to ask ourselves, does this make any logical sense whatsoever?
That brings us to Section 2, Mutiny and Military Punishment, the Logical Theory. Let's pull back from the sensationalized Hollywood myth for a second and step into the highly practical and frankly very brutal reality of Roman military discipline.
Modern historians have proposed an incredibly convincing alternative theory here, and it builds a completely different narrative. Step 1. The troops who are facing terrible weather and the terrifying prospect of crossing the open channel into the unknown, well, they actually mutinied. They just refused to board the ships. Step 2, Caligula, who absolutely cannot afford to look weak in front of the army, demands strict obedience. And step 3, since he obviously can't just execute 2 entire legions, he issues the ultimate demeaning punishment. He gives them humiliating busy work.
Just consider the contrast here. On one hand, we have the myth of a madman trying to fistfight a water god. On the other, we have a highly calculated psychological military punishment. It's like he's saying, oh, you refuse to fight the Britons like elite soldiers? Fine, go pick up beach debris like toddlers. Imagine the intense humiliation of these hyper-proud legionaries being forced to carry heavy packs of literal seashells all the way back to Rome to parade in a triumph. It wasn't madness at all. It was a deeply vindictive boss putting his mutinous employees right back in their place.
Moving on to Section 3, Lost in Translation, the Linguistic Keys. Guys, this is where things get really fascinating. We are going to act as linguistic detectives for a minute and look at the actual Latin words used in these ancient accounts. Okay, so the absolutely crucial point here is the word musculi. Now, in standard Latin, yes, it translates to seashells or mussels. But, and this is a huge but, in Roman military slang, musculi was the exact term used for the small, protective engineers' huts or mantlets used in army camps. So when Caligula called off the invasion, he probably just gave the standard military order for his men to pack up the musculi, literally pack up the camp huts. Decades later, historians saw that word and twisted it into its literal, civilian meaning just to make him sound insane. And get this, we have a second linguistic reveal to back this up. The word concha. Again, sure, it can mean a mollusk or a shell, but it also translates to small, shell-shaped boats. It is highly, highly likely that Caligula ordered these small boats to be gathered up and paraded in his Roman triumph to symbolize his crossing of the sea, not a literal pile of beach shells. The wordplay was completely, deliberately manipulated by later writers. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, the hostile historians, gossip over fact. Because if the story was twisted, we really need to scrutinize the primary sources. Who exactly were the men who recorded this event and forever shaped our view of this dynasty? You have to consider the chronology here. It's a real game changer. Caligula ruled from 37 to 41 AD. But Suetonius, our main primary source for the whole seashell story, he didn't write his account until around 120 AD. And Cassius Dio, he wrote his history in 229 AD. We are talking about a massive chronological gap of 80 to nearly 200 years. These men were absolutely not eyewitnesses taking notes on the beach. Honestly, these specific writers acted way more like tabloid journalists for the Roman aristocracy. Because they lived decades after the events, they relied heavily on popular rumor and hearsay. But more importantly, They were writing for a senatorial aristocratic audience, an audience that absolutely despised the power of the emperors. It was very much in their best interest to paint the early emperors as crazed, unhinged despots. This dynamic is perfectly captured by how historical gossip just snowballs. Take the famous myth that Caligula made his horse Incitatus a Roman consul. Even Suetonius admits in his own text, it is said that he thought about making his horse a consul. It was a rumor. It was probably just a joke Caligula made to mock the Senate, basically saying, my horse could do a better job than you guys. But because it was written down, it was accepted by later generations as a hard, factual example of absolute madness. So, let's move to our final section. Section 5, History by the Victors, the Political Agenda. This is where we uncover the deep, structural paradoxes of Roman political culture. Why was there such an intense incentive to smear this specific emperor's name? You know, we tend to think everyone hated Caligula, but the political reality of Rome was far more fractured than that. The army? They were fiercely loyal to him. He paid them well, and he carried the legacy of his super popular father. The commoners viewed him favorably too. He was their golden prince who built infrastructure and hosted massive games. But the Senate, the aristocratic elite, they were incredibly hostile. They deeply feared his power and their own loss of traditional authority. The absolutely crucial point to take away from this is that Caligula wasn't necessarily crazy. He was politically dangerous to the establishment. He actively curtailed senatorial power. He attempted to rule as a Hellenistic Eastern-style god-king, which completely bypassed all the traditional Roman aristocratic structures. He elevated his own favorites instead of the old nobility. He just wasn't playing the Senate's game, and that made him a mortal enemy to the very men who ultimately wrote the history books. Which brings us right back to that timeless adage, history is written by the victors. Caligula was ultimately assassinated by the Praetorian Guard with senatorial backing. Now, after his violent murder, the Senate and his successors desperately needed to justify their illegal coup. I mean, how do you justify murdering an emperor who was actually quite popular with the common people and the military? Well, you brand him an irredeemable, raving monster. So they subjected him to an ancient practice known as damnata Maria. It was a deliberate post-mortem smear campaign. The whole goal was the complete banishment of his true memory, destroying his statues, erasing his positive legacy, and permanently replacing it with extreme sensationalist propaganda. You know, like a story about a madman ordering his army to go stab the ocean. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If Caligula, the ultimate mad emperor, was largely just a victim of hostile historians, mistranslations, and ancient political bad press, what other historical villains have we completely misunderstood? It really makes you think, doesn't it? I hope this seminar explainer has empowered you to look at historical narratives with a much more critical, analytical eye. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep questioning what you think you know.